Prosecutor Brian Mason, confident in his power, denied Rachel Thompson a fair trial due to her race. Unbeknownst to him, Rachel, a determined journalist, was already gathering proof of his financial corruption. Her covert investigation would soon expose a scandal that shook the city to its core, surprising even seasoned observers. Rachel Thompson, a woman of slight build, just past 40, carried herself with the kind of quiet strength that came from years of fighting for what was right. Her thick black hair was almost always pinned into a tidy bun, a testament to her disciplined nature, and her deep, sharp brown eyes that seemed to see straight into a person's core, were her most powerful tools. They spoke of a mind that missed nothing, catching lies and uncovering truths. The fine lines etched around her eyes and mouth were marks of years spent working tirelessly, nights where sleep was a luxury and worry was an unwelcome companion. Rachel's journey had never been easy. She grew up in a neighborhood where each small victory felt monumental, earned only through grit and sacrifice. Her rise in journalism was a testament to her resilience. Starting at a small-town newspaper, she poured herself into her work, sifting through piles of records and following leads others dismissed as inconsequential. Her relentless pursuit of justice was the signature of every article she wrote, earning her the trust of those who had been ignored or unjustly vilified. To her readers, she was not just a journalist. She was a voice for the voiceless, championing the stories of those trapped by society's blind spots and the justice system's flaws. But now, the very fearlessness that defined her had become a liability. The courtroom, with its wooden benches and the stale scent of old varnish, felt as stifling as a cage. Rachel sat at the defendant's table, her heart thudding against her ribs, feeling the walls press in. The gaze of Prosecutor Brian Mason pinned her in place. He stood tall and stern at his lectern, his sharp chin lifted and eyes narrowed in a way that suggested not only certainty, but indifference. The graying hair at his temples did nothing to soften the hard lines of his face. He was notorious for his ruthless, almost theatrical displays of control over court proceedings, especially against those he deemed unworthy of leniency. Rachel saw it in his pale blue eyes as they skimmed over her. She was already dismissed, judged, reduced to irrelevance. The charge of petty theft was ludicrous on the surface, something that would have been laughable had it not loomed over her with the threat of dismantling her career and reputation. She felt a tremor in her hands but forced them still, maintaining an outward calm. To Mason, she wasn't a respected journalist. She was a woman whose heritage and presence threatened his tidy narrative. He disregarded every counter-argument, every piece of evidence brought forth by her defense, applying the letter of the law with a coldness that bordered on cruelty. Each word he spoke echoed like a gavel pounding down on her fate. Rachel, for all her inner strength, felt the unfamiliar sting of helplessness. This time, the system that she had spent her life challenging was now focused squarely on her. But deep within, Rachel knew she was not someone who broke easily. This trial was no longer just about clearing her name. It was about exposing the truth behind the polished facade of justice. She realized she was not only fighting for herself now, but for everyone who had been wronged by the likes of Mason. The battle would not end in this courtroom. This was only the beginning of a much larger struggle, one where she would have to uncover the truths hidden behind power and prejudice. And Rachel Thompson was more than ready for that fight. Rachel had never known defeat, and the humiliation in court only steeled her resolve to fight for the truth. After the court session where her voice was silenced and dignity trampled, she knew that if no one would support her, she would find a way to emerge victorious on her own. That same evening, back at home, Rachel sat at her old wooden desk cluttered with notebooks, printouts, and case files, and began taking action. Her fingers, accustomed to quick work, tapped the keys of her laptop as she reached out to old contacts and sources. Rumors of Mason's corruption had been circulating for years, but no one had yet gathered enough evidence to bring him down. He was known for his connections in high places and his ability to remove obstacles from his path. But Rachel possessed a rare combination of persistence and intuition, making her a formidable opponent. She reached out to former colleagues who had once been her mentors, coaxing rare archival data and old articles that might shed light on Mason's past. Working late into the nights, Rachel combed through dozens of documents, financial records, and court transcripts. Stacked high on her desk, they formed a tangled web that needed unraveling. She hunted for the smallest discrepancies, studying signatures, analyzing money transfers, and scrutinizing suspicious contracts. With each discovery, a picture emerged of meticulously orchestrated schemes Mason used to enrich himself and those close to him. The deeper she delved, the clearer it became. Her adversary wasn't just a strict, ruthless prosecutor, but a man with an extensive network of influence and powerful backing. Sometimes, fear would rise in her throat when she contemplated the potential consequences of her investigation. But Rachel understood that this was her only chance to reclaim justice, not just for herself, but for all who had suffered under Mason's tyranny. Each night spent fact-checking and contacting sources brought her closer to exposing the truth. In moments when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, she recalled Mason's icy stare in the courtroom and the burning sense of injustice that had seared through her. She knew that soon the day would come when the truth would break free, and Mason would have to face the consequences of his actions. The night was dark, and rain gently pattered against George Hayes's office window. Rachel was on her 100th review of the stacks of papers, determined not to miss a single detail. Her heart clenched when she stumbled upon a document that would change the course of her investigation. It was a report detailing multi-million-dollar transfers funneled through offshore accounts disguised as charitable donations to obscure funds. Rachel's eyes lit up. She now had proof that could destroy Mason's career. George, who had been quietly observing her from across the room, noticed how she froze over the papers. "Did you find something?" he asked, rising from his seat and walking over. Rachel slowly lifted her head, her gaze full of determination. "Yes, and it's going to change everything." With a pounding heart, she sent the files to the editorial team, ensuring that the story would live on, even if something happened to her. But before publication, she knew she had to confront Mason in person. This was more than a battle for truth. It was a chance to show him that his power was no longer absolute. She found him in his opulent office, saturated with the aura of power and arrogance. The walls were adorned with expensive artwork, and the air was laced with the faint scent of cigars. Mason greeted her with a disdainful smile, crossing his arms over his chest. "Do you really think you can change anything?" he said coldly. His eyes burned with fury, but deep within them, Rachel saw a flicker of worry. "Your games are over, Brian," she responded firmly, holding up the printed evidence. She knew that every word, every move now counted. Mason stepped forward, his voice low and threatening. "You have no idea who you're up against. You're playing with fire, Thompson." But Rachel was ready. She looked him straight in the eye, refusing to be intimidated for even a second. He didn't know that the publication had already been set in motion, unstoppable. The truth he had worked so hard to bury was on its way out, and there was no turning back. The morning after the publication, the city erupted with the news. Calls flooded the editorial office, the streets buzzed with conversations, and headlines blazed with Brian Mason's name and the exposure of his corruption. The people who once viewed Mason as an untouchable symbol of power saw him now on the brink of collapse. Outrage and demands for justice surged through the community, sparking protests and calls for accountability. What began as Rachel's personal battle for truth had become a citywide movement. The once imposing prosecutor was summoned to court to explain himself. His cold confidence had deserted him as he walked into the room, surrounded by witnesses and journalists armed with cameras and recorders. Now he stood as the accused, in the very place where he had once ruthlessly passed judgment on others. His face, pale and strained, betrayed an inner turmoil and helplessness in the face of impending disaster. Rachel watched with a sense of triumph and pride. She felt the reward of her years of struggle, the endless nights of document review and phone calls, finally bearing fruit. Her work had not only liberated her, but given voice to countless others silenced by the system. This was the moment when truth and courage combined to break the chains of bias and injustice that had long seemed unbreakable. Mason stood where he had once delivered merciless speeches, confident of his rightness and impunity. Now, realizing his defeat, he could barely meet the eyes of those he had once scorned. Rachel's story had become a living testament that even the most powerful figures could fall before the power of truth when challenged by someone brave and relentless enough.